My name is Maya Ellison. I'm 23, and for the last 3 years, I've used forensic genetic genealogy to hand strangers back, the family someone tried to erase from their history. I never once thought I'd need my own lab to find mine. It's strange work to explain to people who don't already know it. I sit at a desk most days, with a spit kit's raw data on one screen, and 140 years of census records on another, looking for the exact centimorgan overlap that tells a 50-year-old man he has a half-sister he never knew existed. Or tells an adoptee that the aunt, who raised her cousin 2 states over, has been searching for her since 2003. I'm good at it. I was flagged for a state cold case consulting program last spring specifically because I can find a match other analysts miss, the kind buried under 3 generations of name changes and second marriages. I have never once, in 3 years, run that same search on my own DNA. I told myself it was because I already knew my story car accident no other family found. I never once asked myself why a search that takes me 40 minutes for a stranger had never taken me 40 minutes for myself. The party was for my adoptive father, Gerald Ashford's 60th birthday, held in the backyard of the house. I'd grown up in outside Roanoke. 40 guests under a rented tent, a caterer Gerald had complained about for 2 weeks, and then made sure everyone knew he'd paid for himself. I stood near the gift table in the one good dress I own, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper, because I like the way it looks better than anything from a store. Inside was a restored 1962 Zippo lighter, the same model his own father had carried, which I'd found at an estate sale and spent 4 months having professionally replated, because Gerald mentioned once, years ago, in the only unguarded conversation we'd ever had, that his father's lighter had been lost. The year he shipped out for basic training, and he'd never stopped thinking about it. He opened it in front of everyone. He turned it over once, thumbed the hinge open and shut, and for 1 second, I actually thought I'd gotten it right. Then he looked up and laughed, the way men laugh when they want a room to laugh with them. "A lighter," he said, loud enough for the tent poles to hear it. 18 years I gave you a roof, and I get a $5 antique. He set it down next to an unopened bottle of scotch from a golf buddy and picked his drink back up. Someone near the bar chuckled, unsure if it was a joke. My cousin Brianna, Gerald's actual daughter from his second marriage, had given him a fly fishing trip to Montana, prepaid a card that just said, "Love you, Dad," in gold script. Nobody at that table asked her how much thought she'd put into it. Thought was never the currency I was expected to pay in. Cost was. I'd learned that by the time I was 9, the year Gerald sat me down at the kitchen table and explained, in the calm, instructional voice he used for things he considered life lessons, that gifts should always be proportionate to what a person had actually contributed to a household. I never once asked him what my contribution was supposed to be measured against. I was 9. I just started keeping receipts. "It's not $5, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since arriving. "It's the same model your father carried. I had it. Don't correct me at my own party." His voice had already dropped the joking tone, the one that only ever lasted until someone contradicted him. My adoptive mother, Linda, looked up from the dessert table and then looked back down, fast, the way she always did whenever the air in a room started to change. "I worked for months finding that," I said, quieter now, aware that I'd already lost whatever version of this conversation ended well. A man from Gerald's office, someone I half recognized from a Christmas party years ago, leaned toward another guest and asked, not quietly enough, whether I was the adopted one. Gerald answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Foster case originally," he said, like he was correcting a minor detail on a form. "We took her in when nobody else would. Her people were gone." I had never once heard him use the word foster before. Every document I'd ever seen, every school form, every insurance card, said adoption finalized closed. I filed that word away, the way I file away an unexplained match on a chart, a small inconsistency I didn't yet have the rest of the picture to understand. Gerald crossed the space between us in 2 steps and slapped me across the face, hard enough that the sound of it stopped every conversation under that tent at once. 18 years of ingratitude, he said into the silence, and you want to lecture me about a lighter. My cheek burned. Nobody moved 40 people. I had grown up calling family friends stood very still, and watched a man hit a grown woman, and then reach for his drink again, like nothing had happened. And I understood, in that exact second, standing there with my face still stinging, that I had spent my entire life waiting for a version of this family that had never once existed. Linda came over eventually, dabbing at my cheek with a cocktail napkin, like it was ketchup instead of a handprint, murmuring that Gerald didn't mean it and that I should just let it go. It's his birthday. I have heard some version of that sentence at nearly every birthday, every holiday, every parent-teacher conference, for 18 years. Always delivered in the same soft, apologetic voice, always asking me to be the one who absorbed it. I let her dab at my face for exactly as long as it took me to realize no one else was going to say anything different, and then I stepped back. I didn't cry. I want to be precise about that, because I know the shape people expect this kind of moment to take, and it isn't the shape it actually took. What happened instead was something colder. I have spent 3 years training myself to notice patterns other people miss. A shared segment of DNA, buried 4 generations deep. A birth record that doesn't quite match a death certificate. The specific kind of silence a family goes quiet with when you ask the wrong question at dinner. Standing under that tent, I ran the same instinct on my own life for the first time, and what came back wasn't grief. It was recognition. I had been collecting small, unexplainable silences from that house my entire childhood, and I had never once let myself add them up. There was the silence whenever I asked what my biological parents looked like, met every time with the same 3 sentences. Young couple, car accident, no other family found. There was the silence around the framed photo. Gerald kept in his study of a car with its front end crushed. A photo he told me once was a reminder to drive careful, which I now realized I had never actually looked at closely, not once, in 18 years, because some part of me had learned early that looking closely at things in that house was never rewarded. There was the silence of an insurance settlement. Gerald mentioned exactly once at a dinner. When I was 14, before Linda changed the subject so fast, I assumed I'd misheard him. I picked up my bag, left the lighter on the table where he'd set it down, and walked out through the side gate, while the party slowly started talking again behind me, already reshaping the story into something they could repeat at their own dinner tables, without discomfort. It was past 10 by the time I reached the end of the block, walking because I didn't trust myself to drive yet. My hands steady, but my breath doing something strange and shallow I didn't like. A car pulled alongside me on the empty road. Slow, headlights low, I kept walking. Every instinct from every safety class I'd ever half listened to telling me to keep moving, until the window rolled down and a man in his 60s, gray-haired, leaned toward me with his hands visible on the wheel. "Maya Ellison," he said, not a question. I stopped. Nobody outside that house had used my full name like that in years, like it was a fact they'd been carrying rather than something they'd just learned. "Who are you?" "My name is Walter Grimes. I used to be a detective with the county sheriff's office." He held up a card through the window, didn't get out, kept his distance the way someone trained in de-escalation would. "I worked your parents' accident case 18 years ago. I've been trying to find you since the week I retired, and I recognized you tonight from a photograph I've kept in a case file I was never supposed to keep." I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. My parents died in a car accident when I was 5. That was the entire story I'd ever been given. 4 words repeated at birthdays and school forms for 18 years. Car accident, driver unknown. "That's the part I need to tell you," he said. "And I understand if you don't believe a word of it tonight. You don't have to. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at one file and decide for yourself." I stood on that dark road for what felt like a long time, my cheeks still warm from Gerald's hand, weighing a stranger's folder against 18 years of a story I'd never once been allowed to question. I noticed, almost clinically, that my hands had finally started to shake, not from fear of the man in the car, but from the specific vertigo of realizing that the 2 facts sitting in front of me, driver unknown, and a retired detective who'd apparently spent 18 years unable to let the case go, could not both be true. I have built an entire career on the principle that evidence outperforms memory every single time, that a strand of mitochondrial DNA will tell you the truth, long after every person in a family has agreed quietly to tell you something else. I got in the car. Not because I trusted Walter Grimes, because for the first time in 18 years, someone had shown up at the exact worst moment of my life, holding a folder instead of an excuse. And some part of me, the part that runs matches for strangers every single day, needed to know what was inside it. More than I needed to be safe. I didn't know yet that the file in his passenger seat had a case number that matched. Almost exactly the same 18 years. I'd spent under that tent, believing I was simply hard to love. Walter Grimes lived alone in a small house. 40 minutes outside town, the kind of place with too many bookshelves and not enough furniture, and he set the file on his kitchen table without ceremony, the way you'd set down. Something you'd been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing the weight of it. "Before you open that," he said, "I need you to know, I retired 2 years before this case would have closed properly. I never got to finish it. That's the part that's kept me up more nights than I'd like to admit." The folder was thicker than I expected. The way my own case files get thick when nobody involved has told the whole truth the first time. The top sheet was an accident report, dated 18 years ago in June, Route 222 vehicles, single fatality report, listing both my parents, a note in the margin in handwriting. I didn't recognize. Driver of second vehicle fled scene, not located. Not located. I had grown up with driver unknown. This said not located, which in my professional life is an entirely different category of fact. Unknown means nobody had a name. Not located means somebody did. Underneath the report was a page of scene photographs, printed in the flat gray of old department equipment. My parents' car folded around a guardrail at an angle. I made myself look at for exactly as long as it took to understand it, then didn't look at again. There was a second photo, further back, of skid marks crossing the center line, and a third of a paint chip bagged and labeled with an evidence number, dark blue, non-factory, the kind of detail that means nothing to a stranger and everything to a lab. "We had a partial plate," Walter said, 3 digits, a paint transfer sample off my parents' guardrail, and a witness who described the second car as a dark blue sedan, older model, driven by a man. He turned another page. "We ran the partial through DMV, got 41 possible matches in the county." I was 2 weeks from narrowing that list when the case got quietly reassigned to a detective, who closed it within a month as unsolvable, citing insufficient evidence. He looked at me. "I've seen a lot of cases go cold from bad luck. I've seen fewer go cold that fast, that clean. Right after I'd started asking the right questions. Who reassigned it? Captain's office. No reason given in writing, which itself was unusual. I asked twice and got told, both times, that resources were being reallocated to active cases. 18 years ago I let that answer go, because I was 29 and new, and it wasn't my place to push back on a captain. I've regretted it every year since. I kept my own copy of this file in a box in my garage the entire time I was still working, which technically I wasn't supposed to do, and which is the only reason any of this still exists to show you tonight." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the same tight, procedural calm I use at work when a match comes back. Too perfect to be coincidence. You think someone made it go away. I think someone had the money and the connections to make it go away, he said. And I think whoever it was ended up, 6 weeks later, filing for emergency kinship placement of a 5-year-old girl who had just lost both parents in a hit and run. Nobody was looking for anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I drove home at 1 a.m. with the case number written on the back of Walter's card, and instead of going to bed, I opened my work laptop at my kitchen table and did. For the first time in 3 years, exactly what I do for strangers every single day. I pulled a public probate index and searched my own name. The guardianship filing was dated 6 weeks after the accident. Emergency kinship placement Gerald Ashford, listed as a family friend of the deceased, rather than any blood relation. A category I'd never once seen used successfully outside actual extended family. Because kinship placement exists specifically to bypass the longer licensing process required of unrelated foster families. I read the filing 3 times. Family friend, not neighbor, not coworker. Family friend, a phrase vague enough to mean almost anything, specific enough to sail through a court that had no reason yet to look closely. I found the caseworker's signature on the bottom of the second page, a name I photographed and set aside for later and a note in the file margin, in different handwriting, reading expedited per court request. Expedited placements exist for genuine emergencies. A newborn with nowhere else to go, a child in immediate danger, a 5-year-old with a state-appointed guardian ad litem already assigned, and a courthouse 2 miles from 3 separate licensed foster agencies did not, by any standard I understood, meet that bar. Someone had wanted the process to move fast enough that nobody had time to ask why a family friend, nobody in the extended family could name, was suddenly first in line. I spent the next 4 days doing the thing I know how to do better than almost anything else. Building a paper trail nobody else could see yet, quietly, on my own time. The way you build a case for a client who has no idea, yet how much is actually buried in their own history. I requested the county's vehicle registration archive from that year through a records request. I filed under my lab's name instead of my own, the kind of professional courtesy request that raises no flags. I cross-referenced every dark blue sedan registered within a 15-mile radius of the accident scene against insurance claims. Filed that same month, Gerald's name came back on the 3rd page. A 2004 Buick, dark blue, reported to his insurer 11 days after the accident as damaged in a parking lot incident. Repaired at a body shop 2 counties away, a shop that, according to state licensing records, had lost its certification 4 years later for falsifying repair documentation on at least 2 other vehicles. I sat with my laptop open until the sun came up, running the numbers the way I run a DNA match, over and over, hoping each time the pattern would resolve into something less certain than it kept resolving into. A partial plate, a dark blue sedan, a body shop with a documented history of falsifying repairs. A guardianship filed 6 weeks later by the exact man who owned that car, under a legal category that let him skip the scrutiny a real stranger would have faced. I called the body shop's old address into a reverse lookup and found, buried in a business registration filing from that year, a silent partner listed on the LLC. Gerald's older brother, Thomas Ashford, a man I'd met exactly twice in my life, both times at funerals, who I now understood had owned, or partly owned, the exact shop that repaired the exact car that matched the exact partial plate from my parents' accident report. I sat back from the screen and let that sink in fully, the way I let a 5th-generation DNA match sink in, before I ever put it in a report, not with excitement, with the slow, settling weight of a fact that is about to change how a whole family understands itself. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting at that table at 4 in the morning, because I've spent 3 years describing exactly this feeling fine for other people, and I'd never once had to sit inside it myself. It isn't dramatic. It's small and physical and specific. My jaw ached from clenching it without noticing. My eyes stung from the screen, not from crying. I kept refreshing a page that wasn't going to change the way you check a lock you already know is locked, because some part of you needs the motion more than the information. My coffee went cold beside the laptop, and I drank it anyway, in one long swallow, just to have something in my hands that wasn't a mouse. I thought about the framed photograph in Gerald's study. The crushed front end he'd told me was a reminder to drive careful. I understood now, sitting in my kitchen with a stranger's case file spread across my table, that I had walked past a photograph of my own parents' killer's excuse for 18 years, hung on a wall like a lesson, and never once been close enough, or trusted enough, to ask whose car it actually was. I texted Walter at 6 in the morning, before I'd even decided whether I was going to send it. He called back within 2 minutes. I found the shop, I said. Thomas Ashford's shop, Gerald's brother. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. That's the piece I never had, Walter finally said, and his voice had gone rough in a way it hadn't been the night before. I spent 2 years trying to connect that repair shop to anyone, and every lead dried up because Thomas Ashford's name never once appeared on the paperwork I had access to. You just did in 4 days what I couldn't finish in 2 years. I asked him the only question that mattered by that point, the one I'd been circling since Route 221st appeared on that accident report at his kitchen table. If Gerald caused the accident, why would he take me in? Why not just let the case go cold and disappear? Walter was quiet again. Because a cold case is still open, he said. A closed one isn't. And there's no faster way to make a detective stop. looking hard at a hit and run than to have the man everyone already suspects turn around and become the grieving family's hero. The one who took in the orphaned little girl nobody else wanted. Nobody investigates a man who just did something that generous. It's the oldest trick in the world, Maya. He didn't take you in to protect you. He took you in to protect himself. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after we hung up, looking at the framed photograph. I didn't have any more, but could still see perfectly. A crushed hood propped up on Gerald's study wall for 18 years, like a trophy. Nobody else was allowed to understand. Before I left Walter's house, that first night, he'd handed me one more thing from the bottom of the folder, almost as an afterthought. A name and phone number written on a sticky note gone brittle at the edges. "Your mother had a sister," he said. "She came by the department twice, the year after the accident, asking about the case. I never got the chance to follow up before I got pulled off it. I don't know if this number's even still good. I kept it anyway." I put the note in my wallet without saying anything, because I didn't yet have the words for what it meant to be handed. On the same night, both the reason my parents died and the first thread back to the family I hadn't known, I still had. I called the number on Walter's sticky note the next afternoon. Standing in my apartment kitchen with my back against the counter, the same posture I use at work when I'm about to deliver a result. "I know will change how a client sees their entire life," a woman answered on the second ring. "Hello? My name is Maya Ellison," I said. "I think you might have known my mother, Renee Whitfield." There was a silence on the line long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. The same silence I'd sat through with Walter on that dark road 2 nights earlier. Then the woman's voice cracked in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Renee's daughter. Oh my God, Maya, I'm your Aunt Diane. I have been looking for you since the year you turned 6. Diane Whitfield told me, over the next hour, a version of my own life I had never once heard. She said she'd driven to the hospital the night of the accident and been told, by a caseworker she never got a name for, that emergency placement had already been arranged with a close family friend, and that further contact wasn't advisable during the transition period. She said she'd hired a lawyer 8 months later to formally petition for custody, and that the petition had been denied on the grounds that the current placement was stable and in the child's established best interest. A phrase I now recognized, sitting in my kitchen, as the exact language used to protect a guardianship nobody had properly investigated. She said she wrote to me every year on my birthday for 6 years, care of an address that turned out, when I checked it later, to belong to a P.O. box Gerald had closed the same year. The letters stopped. She described my mother to me the way no one at the Ashford house ever had, not as a name on a form but as a person. Renee sang off-key on purpose to make people laugh. She kept a garden that never once produced anything edible and didn't care. She'd named me after her own grandmother, a detail I had genuinely never known, because nobody had ever once told me my name meant anything beyond whatever Gerald and Linda had simply liked the sound of. I sat on my kitchen floor and listened to a stranger hand me back small, specific pieces of a woman. I had spent 18 years reduced to 4 words. "Young couple car accident," I asked her, because it was the only way I know how to hold a piece of information that big, whether she would be willing to do a DNA test through my lab. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The kit arrived at her house 2 days later. I walked her through the swab myself, over video call, the same instructions I give strangers, dozens of times a month. Except this time, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to set the phone down twice. I ran her sample myself off the clock, using my own lab credentials on a Sunday, when the building was empty except for the night security guard, who knows me well enough not to ask questions. The match came back that evening. Avuncular relationship confirmed, shared DNA consistent with a biological aunt, probability displayed to 4 decimal places. The way my lab always displays it, a number I have read out to strangers 100 times without my voice ever once, catching the way it caught reading my own. I called Diane back the moment the report finished loading, and she cried on the phone for a full minute before either of us said anything useful. When she finally spoke, she said the thing I hadn't known I needed to hear. More than any legal finding, more than any accident report. "You look exactly like her." I've spent 18 years wondering if I'd even recognize you, and I would have known your face anywhere. I sat in that empty lab for a long time after the results loaded, looking at a percentage that had just handed me back an entire family I'd been told my whole life simply didn't exist. I thought about every form I'd filled out, for 18 years listing next of kin as none. Every school project asking me to bring in a family tree that I'd quietly padded with the Ashfords' relatives, instead of my own. Every single year. I had believed the absence of my mother's family was a fact of the world, instead of a decision someone else had made on my behalf. That was the moment. The arithmetic finally finished itself in my head, the same way it does at work, when the last data point drops into place, and a pattern that looked ambiguous an hour earlier suddenly reads as obvious. Gerald hadn't simply taken me in. Becoming my legal guardian had done something specific and irreversible. As my guardian, he was the only person with legal standing to file a wrongful death claim on my behalf while I was a minor. He never filed one. Not against himself, and not against anyone else. The 2-year window most states allow for that kind of civil action closed quietly, while I was 7 years old. Closed the exact man who had caused the accident in the first place, using the exact legal authority he'd acquired, specifically, by taking custody of the one person who could have made him answer for it. I laid it out on paper, the way I lay out every finding before I send it to a client, because turning a feeling into a document is the only way I've ever known how to make a feeling stop spinning long enough to be useful. Line 1, the accident. Line 2, the reassigned case, closed within a month. Line 3, the kinship filing. 6 weeks later, under a category built to bypass scrutiny. Line 4, the 2-year statute of limitations, expiring in silence while a 5-year-old girl learned to set the table exactly the way she was told. Each line led into the next with a kind of mechanical inevitability. I recognized from 100 other people's fraud. Except this time, every single line had my own name attached to it. I ran the numbers the way I run every case, because numbers are the only part of any of this I've ever fully trusted. A typical wrongful death settlement for 2 working adults with a minor dependent, structured across the years I'd been eligible to receive it, would conservatively have exceeded $1 million. I received none of it because there was never a claim to receive it from. Gerald hadn't stolen money from a trust the way I'd first assumed when Walter showed me that file. He'd done something colder and, I understood now, far more deliberate. He had prevented the money from ever existing as mine at all, and folded me into his household instead. Close enough to control the narrative, far enough from the truth that I would spend 18 years thanking him for a roof deed, built, in part, on the 2 years he had legally erased my only chance at justice. I want to be honest about the exact moment I stopped waiting for Gerald to explain himself, because I noticed it happen the way I notice a match resolve on screen. I was standing in that empty lab at 11 at night, Aunt Diane's DNA report still glowing on the monitor in front of me, and I caught myself already composing, in my head, the version of this conversation where I sat Gerald down and explained everything calmly. And he finally looked stricken and admitted what he'd done. I have run that exact fantasy conversation in my head about small things my whole life. A missed school play, a birthday forgotten, being introduced at parties as the foster case instead of his daughter. I had never once gotten the apology in real life. Standing there, I understood I had been rehearsing this same imaginary conversation for 18 years, always with a different grievance attached, always expecting a different ending than the one I always actually got. I noticed something else, too, standing there. My hands had finally stopped shaking. They'd been unsteady since the party, a low tremor I'd been managing without acknowledging, and somewhere in the middle of building that 4-line timeline, it had simply stopped the way a fever breaks. I don't think it stopped because I felt better. I think it stopped because I had finally given the fear a shape it could sit inside, instead of one it had to keep moving through. I deleted the draft of the speech forming in my head and opened a new document instead. Not a conversation, a filing. I am not, technically, a lawyer, and I want to be clear that everything I did after that point, I did with an actual attorney's guidance. A woman named Renata Cho, who specializes in delayed civil actions and cold case wrongful death claims, someone Walter had worked with twice before and trusted enough to call at 9 at night on my behalf. Renata explained something I hadn't known. Most states allow a delayed filing when fraud or active concealment prevented the original claim from being brought in time. And what I had, thanks to Walter's file: the vehicle registration records, the body shop's falsification history, and now a DNA-confirmed aunt who could testify to active concealment of contact, was close to a textbook case for exactly that exception. This isn't going to be quick, Renata told me on that first call. And it isn't going to be easy, because Gerald Ashford has had 18 years and a great deal of money to build a version of this story where he's the hero. But you've done something in 4 days that most cold case reopenings take investigators years to assemble. You have the paper trail. That's the part people underestimate. Grief convinces juries. Documents convict people. I thought about the lighter sitting on that gift table, about 18 years of birthdays, measured in what I'd cost versus what I'd contributed, about a photograph of a crushed hood hung on a study wall like a lesson I was never allowed to fully read. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place in a family that had never once intended to give me one. I hadn't been rescued. I had been managed, quietly, efficiently, the exact way I manage a genealogical case for a stranger. Every document filed just carefully enough to survive a casual glance. Every gap explainable if you didn't look too closely. Every silence engineered to hold for exactly as long as the person at the center of it never thought to ask. I stopped needing Gerald to admit it that night. I didn't need his face to finally look stricken. I needed the file, and by the time the sun came up over that empty parking lot outside my lab, I had one. The criminal referral moved faster than Renata had warned me it might. Mostly because Walters still had contacts inside the department who remembered exactly how his original case had been pulled out from under him. A detective half Walter's age reopened the file within 3 weeks, working from the same partial plate, the same paint sample, now matched conclusively through modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed 18 years earlier, against a 2004 Buick registered to Gerald Ashford. I sat in on that first meeting with the new detective, not as a witness yet, just as the person who'd handed him a file most cold cases never get. He read through it twice without speaking, the second time slower than the first, and when he finally looked up, he said something I've turned over in my head since. In 18 years working cold cases, I've seen maybe 3 files this clean handed to me by someone outside the department. Most people bring me a feeling. You brought me an investigation. I didn't tell him. It had taken exactly 4 sleepless nights and every professional skill I own. Some things don't need explaining twice. The body shop's old falsification history turned out to be the loose thread that unraveled the rest. 2 former employees, tracked down through business licensing records, were willing to talk. Once they understood the statute of limitations on their own minor role had long since expired. One of them remembered the repair specifically. A rush job on a dark blue sedan, paid in cash, off the books. The invoice never filed because the owner, Thomas Ashford, had told him personally to make this one disappear. Thomas Ashford was deposed 6 weeks after I filed. I sat in the same room as Renata, watching a man I'd met twice in my life, both times at funerals, try to explain a decade and a half of falsified paperwork to a room that already had the paint sample, the registration, and 2 witnesses. He lasted 40 minutes before his own attorney asked for a recess. When the deposition resumed, his story had changed considerably. He said Gerald had come to him the night of the accident, panicked, already drunk, asking for help, making the damage to his car disappear, before anyone connected it to the news report, airing on the radio about a fatal hit and run on Route 220. He said he'd agreed because Gerald was his brother, and because Gerald had promised, in his exact words, to make it worth his while. He said he hadn't known at the time that Gerald intended to take custody of the surviving child. He said he found out about that decision the same way I once believed everyone else had. At a family gathering, presented as an act of extraordinary generosity, Renata asked him, on the record, whether he'd ever considered coming forward. Once he understood what the falsified repair had actually covered up. He was quiet long enough that the court reporter looked up from her machine. I told myself it wasn't my case to reopen, he finally said. I told myself that for 18 years. It was the closest thing to an honest sentence anyone in that family gave me the entire process, and it came from the one person who had the least to gain by saying it. I want to pause here and say something about what surprised me most through all of this, because I think it's the part watch people a story like mine expect least. It wasn't the accident. Accidents happen, and a hit and run, as monstrous as it is at least a single terrible decision made in a single terrible moment. What actually broke something loose in me was watching, deposition after deposition, how many separate adults had encountered a piece of this truth over 18 years, and chosen each time that keeping quiet was easier than disrupting a story that was working out fine for everyone except the child at the center of it. A caseworker who expedited a filing that shouldn't have qualified. A captain who reassigned a case with no paper trail, explaining why. A body shop owner who kept a rush job off the books for his brother. None of them forged my birth certificate. None of them had to. They just each, individually, decided not to ask the one question that would have unraveled it, and their silence added up to 18 years. Exactly the way unfilled accountings add up to a stolen inheritance in every other version of this story you've ever heard. Fraud this large is never one person's signature. It's a dozen people's silence, stacked, each one small enough to look reasonable on its own. The civil case settled before trial. Once Gerald's attorneys understood what a jury would do with a paint-matched vehicle, a falsified repair invoice, and a guardian ad litem who confirmed under oath that the original kinship filing had been expedited under pressure. She couldn't fully explain 18 years later. Linda, my adoptive mother, was never charged with anything. She testified that she hadn't known the full extent of what Gerald had done the night of the accident, only that he'd come home late and agitated and refused to discuss it, and that she'd chosen year after year not to ask him directly. I believe her. I also understand now that choosing not to ask in a house like that one was never really neutral. It was a decision with a beneficiary, and the beneficiary was never me. The criminal case did not settle. Gerald was charged with leaving the scene of a fatal accident and obstruction, charges that existed independently of any statute of limitations, because Virginia, like most states, treats an ongoing cover-up as tolling the clock for exactly as long as the concealment continues. His attorney argued extensively that 18 years of raising me should count as a mitigating factor. The prosecutor's response, which I still think about, was that raising the child of the person you killed is not a mitigating factor when the reason you did it was to make sure that child could never grow old enough to ask why. I saw Gerald once more, at a pretrial hearing in a courthouse hallway that smelled like every other courthouse hallway I'd spent the last several months in. He looked smaller than he had under that tent, the way people always do once the room stops being one they can perform in. I gave you everything, he said. 18 years, and this is what I get. I had rehearsed 100 versions of what I'd say to him, the same way I once rehearsed apologies I never got. What actually came out was quieter than any of them. You didn't give me 18 years, Gerald. You took 2. The 2 I would have had to grieve my parents honestly, and to grow up knowing the truth, instead of learning to be grateful for a lie. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one available to him that would have survived being said out loud, and I walked past him toward the elevator without waiting to find out. Aunt Diane was in the courtroom the day Gerald was sentenced, sitting beside me, and Walter Grimes sat 2 rows back in a suit. I suspect he hadn't worn since retirement. I have a family now that I didn't have a year ago. Not because anyone rescued me the second time either, but because I finally had the tools to go looking for the truth myself, instead of accepting the one I'd been handed at 5 years old by the person who benefited most from my never questioning it. The sentence itself won't undo 18 years, and I've stopped expecting it to. What it did instead was smaller, and, to me, more useful. It put an official record, permanent and public, stating in plain language what actually happened on Route 220, so that the next time anyone tells a version of my story that starts with, "He took her in out of the goodness of his heart," there's a case file that says otherwise. I've learned that's often the most any of us actually get. Not a reversal, a record. I spent Thanksgiving with Diane this year, in the house my mother grew up visiting. at a table with cousins whose names I'm still learning to keep straight. Someone brought out an old photo album, and there, 3 pages in, was a picture of my mother at maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed, holding a garden hose like a weapon, laughing at something out of frame. Diane says I laughed the same way. I wouldn't know. I'd never once heard it described to me before that afternoon, and I sat with that photograph a long time, letting 18 years of young couple, car accident, finally fill back in with an actual person's face. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, the closest I have to a lesson out of all of this. The story someone tells you about your own life is not automatically the truth, no matter how many years they've had to repeat it, no matter how kind or generous it sounds on the surface. If something in your own history has always felt slightly unexplained, a silence nobody quite answers, a document nobody quite lets you see, that feeling is worth following. You don't need a lab or a badge to start. You need the willingness to ask the question you were taught, gently and over many years not to ask. Public records exist, case numbers exist, somewhere almost always. There is a paper trail that remembers the truth, even after the people around you have agreed to forget it. I still work the same job I did before that birthday party, helping strangers find the families someone tried to erase from their history. I understand the work differently now. Every match I confirm for someone else, I think about the year it took me to finally run that same search on myself, and how much of my life I spent believing the absence of an answer was itself the answer. I run my own searches faster these days, and I no longer wait for anyone's permission before I do. If any part of this felt familiar, a silence in your own family that's never once been explained, a story you were told so many times, you stopped questioning whether it was true. I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what the unexplained thing in your family was, and whether you ever found out what it actually meant. And if you want to see where the next family's paper trail leads, follow the channel, because next week's story starts with a locked storage unit and a rare coin collection nobody in the family remembered buying.